right, I'd just like to start by thanking Sarah O and the Information Economy Project and the Journal of Law, Economics and Policy for having the opportunity to do this paper and to talk to you a little bit about it. It's the first time I'm actually presenting this paper, so bear with me. I will say that I hope that I will be talking a little bit more about sort of relationships and affiliation, which is something that you had left off in the questions, though I might have a lot less to say about everything else that Andre has just given us. So, my overall question is one about platforms and policy. I'm going to start off with a question that I think is a way of getting into it, raised by something in the Facebook IPO, and then more generally into ideas of how two or multi-sided platforms relate to ideas of community and the economics of community, as well as ideas of team production, which I think suggests some policy implications if we think about, and I'm going to try to explain the connections between this, right? So what's the question, right? Okay, so this is, obviously many of you may have seen this, Mark Zuckerberg, right, and the actor who played him since it's Oscar season, right? And so, obviously he can get publicity. So if you follow the Facebook IPO at all, one of the things included in the filing is a letter from him, right, to the to potential investors, right? Over 2,000 words. It talks about how Facebook was not originally. This is almost illegible for you, sorry, but this is what it looks like. Facebook was not originally created to be a company. You can pull it up on Edgar. Here's a little bit more of this. It talks about a bunch of things, right? A lot of the press focused on its endorsement of something called the hacker way, right? We're going to continue the way we do business and innovate internally, but there's also a lot of this language, and you don't know whether you buy it or not, right? What's the point of this? We don't build services to make money. We make money to build better services. If that's the case, why are you asking for $5 billion? But no, that's fine, right? Whatever. But why do this? And I'm a lawyer, but I'm not really a lawyer. I'm a law professor, right? So I asked real lawyers, real corporate lawyers, would you let your client in an IPO submit a long letter with lots of representations, right? And so this is the unscientific response, right? The answers were on this continuum, right? Of these, this large sample of 6, right? And they range from no to hell no, right? So let's think about this, right? Why, how could we explain this letter, right? And things like this. You could say, and I want to stick to rational, explanations, right? So obviously you could just want publicity, but you can be on SNL, so you don't need to do this, and not many people read the IPO documents relatively. It could be a way to sort of address the investors and say, look, I'm going to do this differently, don't vote me out like Steve Jobs or something like that. But if you look at the deal, he's going to have over 50% voting control. So he's got a lot of power for not getting voted out, right? So it's not clear, why are you doing this? Now, I think, actually, this relates to a broader issue that's come up. A number of people have written about this, including people, I think, on the stage, about how what we used to think of as walled gardens, right? We used to think of as sort of closed platforms are not necessarily bad in and of themselves, right? There was an assumption in the legal literature, at least 4 or 5 years ago, that an open network, an open platform was automatically better, right? And so, there were these strong negative connotations, right? You think about the book by Jonathan Zittrain and the idea of networks of control. But I think after the last few years, we realized that people really like some of these controlled networks, and they have a lot of things going for them. So the question is how, if at all, do we sort of relate between law and policy with this type of closed platform, right? A walled garden, if you want to use that term. I think, you can think that there's a whole bunch of different, obviously there's more than 2 dimensions, but think about 2 dimensions, right, between sort of an open platform and a closed platform, right? The poster child, right, Wikipedia is very open. But you also have another dimension. You can think, well, some consumers are really like, they're like potted plants, right? The sort of the Marshall McLuhan idea, right, of TV, right? Cable TV is pretty closed, and the consumer just sort of sits there. That's what we think anyway, right? But in others, the user's relatively dynamic, right? The user produces a lot of the quality in the platform. Think about Facebook. If you built a Facebook and nobody came, what would you have, right? And Andre, I think I'm going to from now on say multi-sided platform. Instead, I always say two-sided platforms because of the the early two-sided market literature. And I just put two in quotes, right, like scare quotes kind of, because there could be more than two. But just the example, and I think many of you are very familiar, but for the few of you who might not be, right, think of a newspaper, right? You have this idea of, if you priced the ads and the paper separately, you might not get to the best result. The interaction between the two sides suggests maybe you give away the paper free and you push the demand curve out and you get additional revenue, right, from the advertisers. And that's the idea of the two-sided platforms. I spent a lot of time on that because so much of it was just sort of explained to you. But what I would say is that there's an overlap between sort of ideas of community and relationships and two-sided platforms, right? And I don't want to sound just like fuzzily about community. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Albert Hirschman had talked about the economics or the social relationships and how they relate to economics of communities, right? Schools, congregations, et cetera, and how that could be relevant for some, not all, but some platforms, right? It might not be relevant for smartphone development, but it might be relevant for Facebook or Wikipedia, et cetera. So, right, two multi-sided platforms. You have some that might not have much community aspect to them. Maybe Visa, right? They try to create affiliations, I suspect. I don't know how it works, right? But you can get your card with your university. I'm sure you can get your George Mason University Visa card, right? But then you have ones that probably do have a little bit more community interaction, or something like community interaction, like Facebook or Wikipedia, right? What I want to suggest, though, is that one explanation for why you saw that letter, right, that IPO letter, things like that, is that the user is essentially a team member in production in some platforms, right? In other words, sure, you have a multi-sided platform, but it's not simply the user as user. The user as actually part of the production. So the question is, and think about Facebook, think about Wikipedia, are these platforms that are characterized by user production, and that could be form of innovation, it could be creativity, simply be data sharing, whatever, right? Are they are these consumer products? Are they communities? Are they neither or both? I suspect there's a range of things that apply. It could be both in various degrees. But obviously they're not all the same, right? You have, again, coming back to the dimensions before, you have some platforms that have users who generate a lot of the value added, and others where they're just sort of pure consumers. Again, just sort of recapping this, some of them have this community element. Some of them have a lot of quality sensitivity. So anyone who's ever seen an internet forum disintegrate knows that it usually happens because quality degrades, and there's this kind of quality death spiral, right? So there could be, some of them have this, and I would submit that that is often going to go hand in hand with the community element. Exit from both multiple sides of a platform might be linked or might not. And so here's what I mean by that. Here's an example, right? So suppose you have someone who runs a sandwich shop, right? And she accepts Visa as payment, right? One side of the Visa platform, but she also goes to Costco to buy rolls and materials to make sandwiches, right? Using it as a payment card, right? She could exit one side. She could stop using, for example, her Visa card to pay without exiting the other. However, if you think about a more traditional sort of community idea of, you think of your school or your congregation, especially if your congregation is something very sort of peer-to-peer, think Quakers or something, right? If you exit from one side, you exit from both, right? If you're producing some of the value and consuming some of the value, you don't really have the opportunity to de-link your exit on both sides. Just a suggestion that might be something important. So what was Hirschman's idea? Hirschman's idea, I think, has had a lot of resonance in things like labor relations and human relations, including things like marriage and families, et cetera, but not as much, I think, in his intended field of origin. And he pointed out that, look, when you have something with a certain amount of community aspect, right, like a club, a church, a synagogue, a school, right, where the people who consume are also the producers and they're quality sensitive, right? What happens if quality starts to degrade? What are their options? And there are both passive and active options. There are destructive and constructive options, right? A passive and destructive option is just sort of neglect, right? Just sort of ignore that things are going bad. A constructive and active one would be to voice, right? Just to have some mechanism to say, look, things are going bad, we should improve them. Sort of destructive of the platform or community, an active option would be to exit. You just leave, right? Well, Hirschman pointed out that, look, normally we think of a product as being the sort of quality price bundle. Quality starts to fall, right? In a competitive market, the seller has to either improve quality or reduce price, so the quality price bundle is still competitive. Okay, so it's sort of self-correcting. What Hirschman suggested was no. In fact, well, not no in that, but in something which is more like a community, right? So school, church, et cetera, congregation. It's actually, if the quality-sensitive members, right, leave first, the most quality-sensitive members leave first, then you could see a quality spiral downward, right? Because the people who are the most sensitive are producing the most quality. They leave, so now you're left with the next group of people, and then they leave, and so on. So you see a kind of degradation. And I think this actually explains, whether this fits generally a lot of offline markets, I don't know, but it does fit something we see a lot, and is potentially another reason to explain the rapid death of things, or rapid decline of some online businesses, right? We like to think that it's low entry barriers, and it may be low entry barriers, but there could also be this aspect of it as well, right? And so this is just more of that. Now, what I would suggest is that if we think this quality preservation idea is important, this might suggest one reason why this sort of walled garden approach may be important, right? It may be easier to preserve quality in that context, but you still have to deal with issues of exit. How do you provide an opportunity for voice? And there's also a possibility of opportunism. I know we've mentioned sort of lock-in before. I'm not sure it's exactly the same thing as lock-in, but I want to point out that there's this possibility of opportunism that people have recognized in the context of team production and corporate governance, right? And so, there's this idea, from Rajan Zingalis, where, if you have team production, right, where, you've got people maybe from both inside and outside, like a platform operator, for example, maybe users, and they're together producing the product as a team. Suppose they're making firm-specific investment, and it's difficult to sort of write everything out contractually in advance. If you have this possibility, there's a possible problem that that one side, if you give them the right to control, the entity, they may actually do better by opportunistically capturing and selling their counterparty's investment than by actually making the firm-specific investment that is optimal for them to make, right? So this is the insight. Corporate governance scholars, Margaret Blair and Lynn Stout, have suggested that where you have this problem, one possible solution is if you can, to dealing with this problem of, where contract is difficult and people are making firm-specific investments, they're difficult to measure and monitor, but they're going to have to divvy up returns, is to allocate that role to a trusted mediating hierarch. That's the term, the kind of awful term that's used, but that's the term, right? So you need this sort of trustworthy governance body, right? Here's this, I don't know whether this helps or not, but here's a 2x2 game that kind of illustrates this problem, right? So the best situation collectively is the bottom right, where the platform operator does something cooperatively and makes their firm-specific investment. The user does the same. If the platform operator doesn't build the platform and you don't do anything, right, you wind up in this northwest quadrant. But the operator has could also just sort of, if you're the user, rather than actually make their firm-specific investment, somehow appropriate your investment, and they might do better, right? That's the sort of the insight from the team production idea. And note here, in both sets of the world, the platform operator has this incentive to act opportunistically, right? They do better on the left side both times, and that makes the user maybe not trust them and moves everyone to the northwest quadrant. That's the idea anyway, right? Can you generalize from this kind of thing? Maybe not, right? Maybe. It's single shot versus iterated, right? An iterated game, you might build trust. That's just two-player versus a massive number. But I think the goal here is just to illustrate what the dynamic is of opportunism that people are concerned with. So what's the point, coming back to this idea of that IPO letter? What do I suggest is going on here? Well, I suggest one way to think about why you would see maybe Mark Zuckerberg write a letter like that, where he's trying to sort of send signals about team production, right? We're going to keep working this way. Is that he's trying to put on the mantle of a kind of trusted mediating hierarch, right? He's trying to say, look, I kind of control this, and I'm going to control it this way, I will continue to divvy up and allocate things the way I've been doing, right? The returns to this sort of firm-specific investment that both we make as the platform operator, that you as the massive user base make. In prior work with David Hoffman, I've looked at sort of Wikipedia and sort of similar concerns of opportunism. Some of you may know this, some of you may not, right? Wikipedia was founded by someone who wanted to build a for-profit, advertising-based encyclopedia. So much of the user base was often concerned, once it took off, that this is eventually the goal here. And they managed a similar problem by building governance institutions and semi-elected dispute resolution bodies and decentralizing a lot of the authority to sort of more trusted users. And so the idea here is that this is sort of a opportunistic behavior sort of pre-commitment strategy, right? So what are the implications? In other words, a way to try to commit to not doing what users fear you might do, right? So what are the implications? I think, and this is where I kind of want to get more specific as the paper progresses, because it's pretty broad. I think the first thing is you can make an argument to create some space for platform operators who kind of opt in to the mediating hierarchy model. If that's what you see this letter is doing, that maybe you create some space within corporate governance and say, look, they kind of opted into this idea. They told their investors off the bat, right? If you think about short-term shareholder returns, and that's how important that usually is in corporate governance, and you think about Ford, right? The old Ford v. Dodge case, right? Maybe this is an argument that you get to sort of a little sort of slack maybe in this because of these justifications. The second one is that this may be an argument for some sort of not necessarily heavy, I would say light regulatory role towards norm generation as a way to bound the hierarchy or to give the hierarchy some grounding, right? Einar Elhaug has made this argument that norms plus law can get you to a better place than either of those do independently, right? Because we can't actually, lawyers would like to, but we can't actually write ourselves into all states of the world, that this is actually a valuable reason for norm generation. And so it's an implication, is maybe this is a field for that as well. The final thing I would suggest is that if we think this is sort of an incipient format, right, this kind of user team production sort of platform, we might need to think about what sort of supporting forms, right, or structures we might use, even if they are simply things that entities can elect into, right? So you see people produce things like, the Digital Corporation Act in Nevada and Vermont. Those are largely about, there may be a step towards this kind of thing, more supporting forms. Those are things like, allowing online board meetings and things like that, as opposed to having only in-person or telephonic board meetings. That suggests that maybe there's a need or a reason to have some development in the sort of corporate structure area. And that's basically it. So if there's time for questions.
Sure. Professor Hazlett told me that for moderating the panel, my payment was this bottle of water and the moderator's privilege, which I'm going to invoke now to start off with a question. Before Tom takes the bottle of water away. So towards the end of the paper, so full disclosure, a question from an antitrust guy who's going to try to convince you your paper's an antitrust paper.
Okay.
And you want to make it a corporate governance paper. So towards the end, you say, policy steps that foster, I'm reading now, foster solutions to dominant platforms' team production dilemma may reduce the need for antitrust regulatory intervention. I sure hope so, but I think so what I worry about is a lot of these corporate governance reform. We have choice of law, we have, we can opt into different regimes. Antitrust is mandatory.
Yeah.
Right? You can't escape it. So what I think about when I think about the policy implications here, I think the other way. So I would frame the question to you as follows. Shouldn't what we be worried about is the first order question, the role of antitrust in preventing, or the risk that antitrust law exposure create in preventing contractual solutions to do these sort of neat experimental contractual arrangements that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point, which is that I could see antitrust either fostering or preventing this kind of solution, right? So obviously, if you think you can fall back onto antitrust intervention, maybe you don't generate this solution. And you see this, I think you can see this not only in this situation, but just to think of another platform, an example where I think you could make this argument and it happened maybe the other way, right? People look at broadcast music. And I'm sorry if most of you, probably a lot of you have had antitrust. People look at that as a multi-sided platform. And you could make an argument that broadcast music, the take, for example, Frank Easterbrook's take on it, that this is efficient. Well, yeah, it's efficient, but because antitrust didn't push harder on it, we didn't generate iTunes for 30 years because everyone thought, well, we can just do this. The industry didn't think, arguably it obviated the need for sort of endogenous technological development with respect to music licensing. You think about it now, right? User licensing is so much more difficult in the numbers. So I think that's right. This is a good point. As far as obviously that might be an argument for sort of the more rule of reason step back and see, right? Is contract an approach, or is something like this, which I would not necessarily call contract, but something like this an approach that addresses some of these problems before they become real problems? Yeah.
Questions? Adam.
Hi, I'm Adam Pierre, Case Senator at Georgia Mason University. Thank you for your excellent presentation. A very specific policy-related question going back to Jonathan Zittrich, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, who in this context has said his recommended norm and law solution would be essentially some sort of API neutrality, which is that in a model of team production, as you call it, or user-generated content, if a platform owner or creator comes to benefit from third-party contributions in a significant way, that then potentially the norm or even the legal standard should change for them. And he calls this, of course, API neutrality, a variant towards net neutrality, where basically once they start opening up and allowing these third-party contributions, if standards need to change or they can't, after the fact, close them off in any way, even like it's this potentially an adverse possession type of rule where once you get popular enough, you lose some of your property rights over your platform. So for some of this looks like the beginning of a sort of a forced monetization or common carriage model for these sorts of social media platforms, and even the beginning of almost a public utility type of regulatory system for social media or social networks. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, so, it's interesting. You do see people sort of modifying what you might have called net neutrality or enforced interconnection or whatever you want, essential facilities, whatever you want to call it, in this context, right? So Tim Wu has this recent paper for the OECD meeting, which he talks about how maybe the issue is where there's some sort of deception or lack of disclosure, and that's your gateway into and then you change then you sort of force an open API or something like that, or you freeze an API. The Zitron idea, I think, it goes back into this issue of that's always at the heart of this essential facilities problem, which is that it may in fact deter investment at the front end, right? To say that if you do it now, there's the reliance aspect, right? And so maybe if you have some sort of a disclosure model, or running both ways, both to the platform operator and to the users, that look, this is the way you can kind of address that idea a little bit, the idea of deterring investment as well as user reliance. If you're very clear, you have some sort of disclosure model, but you also might worry, it's a similar idea as with the antitrust idea, that if you pick the wrong disclosure model, you may not get that might have an effect in terms of your ability to get to the sort of best result you can. So I just don't know that we know. I am not necessarily opposed to it. I'm just not sure that we know that would be a wise choice at this point.
Professor Hazlett.
The Zuckerberg approach on the letter and so forth. I mean, it seems that there's a lot of brand development that's crucial, and it's interesting to look at different paths. As soon as you put the Zuckerberg statements up about it's not, for me, it's not about the money. Well, yeah, okay, sophisticated audience smirking. Okay, well, I immediately think of don't be evil. And I hear guys with $20 billion in equity values that it's all about not being evil. And the same smirking. In fact, Ken Aletta's book on Google quotes Andy Grove. Don't be evil. Hitler said he wasn't evil. So that's sort of the end. the polar extreme on the reactions. But the fact is that Google trust business. Okay? Okay, we're going to know everything about you, and you're going to like that because you can trust us. And the game is ongoing, obviously. And they start with the IPO. It's a wonderful opportunity to make the point. Now, with money pouring in, it's not about the money, it's about the trust. Our customers come first. It actually is, it is some irreversible investment because they get hit more on, the don't be evil or the, it's all about the money stuff. And there are other pathways on that. It just is fascinating to look at the jobs in the Apple model. Apple relies on a lot of trust. You're locking into the Apple system, right? And Apple's motto is, we're Apple. You're the customer. We're going to tell you what you like, and you're going to like it. And that works. I mean, it's almost open hostility to the customer. And what do you need a USB? You already got a USB port. That sort of thing.
So I love it.
And we're going to love it because it's Apple, and Apple's going to give us great products, and that seems to work too. So there are these different pathways that are competing out there, and it is quite remarkable.
So this is quick. I actually love that idea about Apple because I always think that you trust Apple the way people used to trust doctors. We know better. You should just trust us,
Well,
right?
yeah.
And that might work, right? It worked for a long time.
And by the way, we're going to charge you a big premium. Okay, get in line early so you can pay it. That sort of thing.
But the other thing I was going to say is I think the reason we smirk is we suspect, I think, what you're suggesting, which is that.
By the way,
Well, I think we suspect that this not being evil or what Zuckerberg's doing is not so much an end in itself as an instrumental, to build the trust. And I think in that way, this is sort of what I've been saying is, I don't know if it's obvious or complimentary, but the idea that that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to use this to take on that mantle of trust.
I think we've hit time. I know there are people still with questions.
Oh.
The panelists have promised that you can attack them at the coffee and answer all of your questions. So please join me in thanking Salil and Andre for their questions.